Shalom, Shavua Tov. Due to popular demand, we will continue another week on Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor, and we spoke about his biography last week, and we also gave the background just to have a quick recap. So we had his background. He was born, raised, was active in Russia. And we also explained that speaking about Russian Jewry is a misnomer because in the Tsarist regime, Jews were not allowed to live in pauper Russia unless they were really rich and were able to buy the privilege. But most of the Jews were not allowed to live in pauper Russia. They lived in the settlement pale of settlement. And that was basically that was Poland and Ukraine that became part of Russia after the partition of Russia in the end of the 18th century. And then during the 19th century, the Russians were under three different tsars. So the Russians were trying A, to persecute the Jews, and B, to Russify them. And it was not very successful. The Jews remained very Jewish, most of them. But nonetheless, it was very difficult time for the Jews, which led, and I wouldn't go into all of the stories that we told last week, but which led in the 1880s, it led to the great immigration mostly to America. So, and as I think that some of you also told me that your parents or grandparents came to the US it's more the grandparents, I guess the great-grandparents, but came to the US in the 1880s during this wave of immigration. Also, Jews were going also elsewhere. So some came to Australia, some came to South Africa. So Jews began to spread from Russia, which was the greatest concentration of Jews in the world back then, and they were beginning to spill out throughout the world. Now, some of the Jews in Russia were encouraging this development because they thought that is the solution. And even there were a few Meshugaim that went to Eretz Israel, and they were called the Chovevei Tzion. So there were people that were encouraging that. But most of the leadership of the Jews in Russia were against the Jews immigrating en masse to other places. And that is for several reasons. One reason was that it was just not practical. Meaning some can live, usually the young and the fit. But most of the Jews were not able to just leave and go to live in a new place, even nowadays, which is much easier, nothing to compare. And yet, for people that needs to sustain themselves and their families, living I don't have to tell you, living one place and making Aliyah or going to anywhere else is extremely difficult. And that is when we have now much easier life, and and usually people don't die in hunger in the streets. But back then, for example, in the United States, there was no social security. You'd come there, if you make it, you made it. If not, you just die. No one would, people may contribute if they want, you can have charity, maybe, but you can also just die from hunger. And these are things that did happen. So things were extremely complicated, and speaking about Eretz Israel, obviously people, again, literally died here from diseases, from hunger, from everything that you wish and don't wish to know about. So it was extremely difficult. It was not a practical solution. You have old people, you have young babies. You cannot just take 5 million Jews and tell them, go. So that was one reason why many of the leaders of Russian Jewry were opposing this solution. The second reason was because it reflected very negatively on the Jews that remained, because they were blamed in having double loyalty. How can it be, if you are real Russian Jews, as you claim that you are, how can it be that you even think about living to another place? And here again, this hypocrisy that is ridiculous. But it happened, it's happening to this day. On one hand, you see the Jews as outsiders, as strangers, and you curse them that they should go to Palestine or should go to wherever they want. And then when they want to leave, you say, you see, they are traitors. They are. So that's, but we spoke about that. Anti-Semitism, it's not a theory. It's a disease. It's a mental disease. And you cannot really expect people to behave in any kind of rationality when they are being anti-Semites. And unfortunately for our forefathers, 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago, anti-Semitism was rampant. And you may say that it's also today, but nowadays it's untrendy to show it off. Maybe, you know what, I'm taking it back. I think in the last 10 years, unfortunately, we are seeing a comeback of which I think we couldn't even, am I correct? 15 years ago, we would have thought that this is a thing in decline. And it's unbelievable what we see nowadays. Anyway, returning 100 years ago, it's easier to speak 100 years ago. So returning to the 1880s, it's already 150 years ago, returning to the 1880s, there were a third reason why some of the leaders didn't want the Jews to leave, and that was that in many of the places that the Jews were immigrating to, there was no real sense of Jewish community, no religious institutions were established. If we speak about the United States, if you remember, the first ordained rabbi coming to the United States in the middle of the 19th century. But that's a joke. So you had thousands upon thousands of Jews, and very quickly it was hundreds of thousands of Jews, and with no real Jewish leadership. So you have no days. Everything that we know today, almost everything that we know today, was established after World War II. And the little that was established before was established in the first half of the 20th century. But if we speak about the second half of the 19th century, it was really a desert. It was a desert in the Jewish sense, the United States. And even more so, we speak about South America, or we speak about Australia. All of these places were very, very difficult to remain Jewish, traditional Jew, if you went there. And again, I don't have to tell you the stories because I'm sure that many of you know it from your personal family history about Jews that came and they tried to be Shomrei Shabbat and they were able to keep it for 1 week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, and they got fired again and again and again. And in the end, they felt I am not in any position to judge anyone, but they felt that if they want to feed their family, they have no other choice but to work on Shabbat. And you understand that in the minute you begin to work on Shabbat, it's a very, very slippery slope to lose completely all Jewish identity. And we are eating the fruits of that to this day. Because Jews that wanted to work on Shabbat but didn't want to be second-level citizens in their shuls or in their community, so they were preferring to join such denominations that would allow them, permit them to work on Shabbat. And that was like a snowball that was feeding itself, and it was basically it was a race to the bottom of Jewish identity and keeping Jewish heritage. And again, it's beyond our scope right now, but I would just say that for these three reasons, and especially the third reason, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor, our hero, also at least publicly opposed Jewish immigration from Russia. Now, it can be that specific people, private individuals that would come to him and ask for an advice, he will tell them, if you are able to, then leave. But his public position was, we should try to solve our problems here in Russia and not dream about things that cannot be realized. And if they would be realized, it would come at great cost. And that was his position even during the pogroms of the 1880s. Now, little did he know, as anyone else there, and again, you cannot blame someone for not being a prophet. Obviously, anyone that moved out of Russia these years made the deal of his life and the deal of his children's life, because he saved them from being there during the Holocaust and during the Soviet regime. So, but how could he know? How could he know? So that's something that I thought is important, just to continue from last week. And now I want to learn with you a few of his halachic responsa that I quoted in the page that you have. So we would walk through some of them. One of me, he was known for his halachic responsa. That was his speciality. He wrote other things, but that was really his speciality. And his answers are part of the special character is that they are extremely long and intricate, and he's taking all of the sources and he analyzes each one. That is something that is much, much beyond the scope of anything that we can do in this shiur. Even if you take one answer, I don't think I would be able to cover it in one shiur. So what we are going to do is just, how do you call it when you take from the ice cube? Scoping? Yes, scoping. So we'll take just something from the top of the cake. I would read from each question, I would read the response, I would read the question, and then the final outcome of his analysis, and I would try to give also at least the main reason as I understand it. But you have here, every source here, I gave the exact source. So if someone does want to follow in, if he finds the response interesting and he wants to follow in, then you can just use the sources noted here and see the sefer. All of his sefarim, I think so, are now online in Hebrew books. And if someone is not familiar here with HebrewBooks.com, which is spelled just as it sounds, HebrewBooks.com, I would extremely recommend just going to the site. It's a very simple site, very simple interface, and you have there, I think now 30,000 books, maybe more. I don't know. I do not keep the trace. It's extremely large library of Jewish sefarim, and some of them are photocopies of very, very old editions, and they are not easy on the eyes. But some of them are very easy to read, and it's just a great, great resource that the gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us with the new technology is enabling us to access very easily. I think all of his. So again, if you find one of the responses here sparks your interest, then I encourage you to go and sit inside. And now we'll begin. So source Aleph is from his responsa named Ein Yitzchak. I think in the end he has 4 or 5 responsa, each one a few volumes, and I just found that all the interesting answers that I was able to find are in the same book. So it's in the Ein Yitzchak, but it's not even his most famous book. His most famous book, again, multi-volume, is Be'er Yitzchak. I think he has also Nachal Yitzchak. Of them, of course, because his name is Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor, then his sefarim are named after Yitzchak. So Ein Yitzchak, this answer is Yom Yudalet Kislev Taf Reish Nun Aleph. That is 1891. 1891 in Kaaoונא. So he writes the answer while he was sitting as the rabbi of Kaaוונא. נשאלתי מאמעריקא. So this is a question he received from the United States. על דבר, יש שם כמה נשים יושבות עגונות. So there are a few women there that are עגונה. What is an aguna? We explained last week. Aguna means chained. That's literally chained. A woman that is chained. Why is she chained? Because the husband is missing. He has disappeared for some reason, whatever reason can be, and she's stuck. She cannot get remarried. Now, he was known for being the Avi Agunot, the father of this chain, the Agunot women, because he was such a Talmid Chacham that he was able to find reasons how to allow these women to remarry according to to the halachic standards. They say, which is very special, there are hundreds of tshuvot in which he allowed these chained women to remarry. They said that not even once after he had decided that testimonies are enough to declare the husband dead, not even once it happened that the husband resurfaced. And there are a few stories about it happened to other rabbis, unfortunately. As you can imagine, I mean, it's a investigating work, and sometimes you are doing your best and you want to help this miserable woman, and you get to the conclusion that she is allowed to remarry because according to the information that we have, it seems that the husband has died. And very unfortunately, the husband reappears, and then it's very sad because the meaning is that she has to get divorced from both her first husband and the second husband, and it means that the children from the second husband, if there are mamzerim. So it's a very, if you know, it's the story that made Shai Agnon famous. That's why it's called Agnon, because his first story was called Agunot. It's a story about a woman that the Rav allowed her to remarry, and then the husband appeared, but the husband understood that she had remarried, and he goes to live in the graveyard near the grave that they put a simple grave for him. It's a very, very dramatic story. Shai Agnon does not need my recommendations. You go and read him. Okay, so that's the story. If he says there are few women, or several women in the States, Agunot, Aniot, so they are poor, because no husband. That's before the feminist revolution. Women do not work. It's important to understand. Women do not work. So they are Agunot, they don't know what's happening with their husband, and they are poor. ושומרות הדברי Torah, and they keep the religion. I mean, it's a free country in America. If you want to just, in Russia, if you are Aguna, you cannot remarry, because the Rabbanut is responsible for what you are doing. The only thing that you can do is convert to Christianity, and then you can remarry. But if you want to keep Jewish, then you are stuck. You're really stuck. But in America, it's a free country. If you want, you go to the city and you declare yourself divorced, or you declare yourself whatever you want, and you can remarry. But they are really religious, and they keep faith. ושואלות, המותר והאסור, אשר מפני צדקתן יושבות עגונות. They sit there, and they are עגונה. מאיזה סיבה? זה כשבעה שנים. So it's already going on for 7 years that they are chained, they're עגונות. What did happen? נשברה האונייה בלב ים. So we speak here about immigration, but it's not planes that people are going with. They are going in ships, and these vessels, not always the prime vessels, not always the best vessels. They are more like this submarine now. Some of them are very, very weak. And this onia, this boat, this ship, כשברה בלב ים, so it broken down in the middle of the sea. שהיו בעליהן על האונייה הזאת, לא רחוק מהמבורג. So there was a line from Hamburg to New York. Maybe there is still is, I don't know. But from Hamburg to New York, you could go on a ship. והיו אנשים, רובם אינם יהודים, so most of the people on the ship were non-Jews. וגם יהודים במספר כמה מאות, but also a few hundreds. We have to remember, these are the years in which you would have dozens of thousands of Jews coming every, you can go to the statistics, it's amazing. Dozens of thousands of Jews coming to New York every year. So on every ship, there were a few hundreds. וניצולו מהם איזה אנשים במספר קטן של 30 או 40 הניכרים. So from the ship there were a few survivors, he says 30 or 40 from the ship. ומאלו העובדים נשארו נשים בלי פתרון, אם מותרות או אסורות להינשא. But you cannot recover the bodies. Again, nowadays they have this, if you saw about the submarine, they went and 4 kilometers down on the ocean, they were able to find the remnants, which is amazing. But back then, no one had the ability, and I would say also, nor the will to do something like that. If they sunk, they sunk. We have our own lives, and we continue. And it's more like these poor guys, that immigrate from the poor countries to the rich countries, in which you have hundreds of people on a tiny boat, and if the thing breaks down, the only thing that is interesting the police in the receiving side is that no one would be able to come in. That's, as you know, I'm sure that you read the news. So it was more or less the situation. So these people went down at sea, and now there are many women that not know if their husband survived or not. It just disappeared. You don't have a body, you don't have a grave, you don't have anything. הספינה נשברה רחוק מהמבורג רק יום אחד. So they were able to travel for only one day. I would guess that the boat was just not really able to do the trip. And after one day at sea, it broke down. וירדה בתהום, עם ארובה דרובה הנוסעים של כמה מאות. So that's a great disaster. Of a few, and again, but back then it was just part of life. So he says several hundreds of people went down, והנה הנטבעים היו בתוך הספינה, הוזים שוכבים על מיטותיהם קודם אור הבוקר. So the survivors gave some account of what did happen. And the ship broke down near dawn, it says, at the end of the night. So people were, that's the worst time, because people were still sleeping. The water was already flooding the ship, and the people were still at their beds. אחר המעשה נשלחו ברי המוראי המלומדים לשוט בתוך הים וירדו בתוך הספינה ומצאו אותם טבועים בכינוס גדול. So then they sent a few ברי המודאי, these are divers, and they saw that the ship is down there. But that's what you have. So what do you do now? You have these women, what do you do? It's not a simple question, because as I said, maybe someone survived and just went on some other coast, and you don't know about it, and he does not have a phone, so he cannot call, and now what? Are you able to allow these women to remarry? And he says, it's not the first time I have this question. וזה זמן רב שנשאלתי הדבר עגונות מלונדון שנטבעו בעליהן, ונודע בזמן רב לנשיהם כי בעליהם נסעו בספינה לאפריקה. So another line, this time from London. I guess that London does not have, they didn't sell from London. I don't know, from where do you sell from England to Africa? From Liverpool, I would guess from Liverpool, yes. So a line, again, I don't know. It says from the women are from London. I don't know where they live, the island. There is a port and Southampton. Okay, so maybe from England, from somewhere in England, they took the boat, and again, somewhere in the journey to Africa, which is not a simple one, the ship was lost. And the same question, and והיה שם גם כן חומרה במים שאין להם סוף. Now I would have to give a 2 minutes explanation. What does it mean? מים שאין להם סוף, endless water. In the Gemara it says that if someone disappeared in the ocean, in the Great Sea, you cannot allow his wife to remarry. Why? If it's the Kinneret and someone disappeared and he does not surface after one day, you know that he's gone. Why? Because you can see the whole place. If you would have resurfaced, he would contact you. But if you speak about the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, and especially the ocean, who knows? He can catch some boat, some life-saving boat, and maybe he's in some deserted island now, and you cannot be sure where is he and if he is alive or not. So the Chachami made an isur. If the husband disappeared in endless water, you cannot allow his wife to remarry. You can only imagine how many women that got stuck in such a situation. So it would seem to be that both of these cases that I just described, the ship going from Hamburg to the US and the ship going from England to Africa, both of them, they disappeared in this endless water, and the wives should remain asurot, they should remain chained. But now that's a great thing. That's an innovation, a like innovation of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor. That's why he was called a via Agunot, because he was able to prove these innovations. And what he said was the following: Danti leitera, I ruled that they are allowed to remarry. במילתא חדתא, an innovation, a new thing. על פי יסוד הכלל של ספרי, דבתרי רובה לא החמירו חז"ל. He says we should look very carefully at the situation. When Chachamim said that if the husband disappeared in endless water, then they knew that most of the people that disappear in endless water, they do not resurface, as they are not Robinson Crusoe, right? They sunk and that's it. But because of the minority of people that may survive, they decided that we should be strict and not allow the women to remarry. But now he says, look, that's only if you have one majority and minority. But if I can add another majority on top of the first majority, then I can allow the woman to remarry. Now, what is the second majority that he wants to add? והנה החתם סופר בסימן נ"ח ובסימן ס"ה כתב, שיש לדון שעתה נשתנה הזמן, ובזמן הזה קבי בדואר בכל המדינות, ותק, that's telegraph. He says, nowadays you have mail and you have telegraph. And he says, if in the minute that we have these devices, we can say that the majority of people that would survive would make contact. It's not like in the days of Chazal that if someone is stranded in some other continent, that's the end. He would never be able even to make his way back. But nowadays, we have these two types of majority. So one majority is that most of the people that would sink would not survive. And another majority is that from the people that do survive, the majority are supposed to make contact, let's say, in a year, 2 years, 7 years. So you have here two majorities. You have two reasons here why to believe that these people died. One, because most of the people sinking in the Great Sea just die. And the second is that if they would have been survival, then it would make sense. The majority is that they would be able to make contact. So we have two reasons to believe that they are dead. One is that they sunk in the Great Sea, and the second is that no contact was made for a long period of time. And under these two circumstances, he says, I'm allowing these women to remarry.
After 7 years or before?
So what exactly is the length of the time? It doesn't say. Maybe in some other tshuva. I don't think that you have to wait for 7 years. The answer was after 7. I mean, the question was asked to him after 7 years, but I don't think that you need to wait for 7 years. Yes, of course it is. Okay. So that's one answer that he gave more than once, as you can see also from this sponsor. That's something that he used again and again in order to allow women to remarry. And you can imagine, if you speak about a boat upon which there were hundreds of men, then we speak about hundreds of women usually that became Agunot. And if you are able in one tshuva to give such an hater, that's an amazing feat. And that's as I said, that's a drop in the bucket of what he was able to do. And of course, we skipped here, meaning it didn't just make it up. He has very long pages upon pages of proofs from the Talmud that you can count on these on two majorities. But that's beyond our ability to learn right now. So you just have to count on him. And if you want, as I said, just go to this tshuva and go over these proofs. Another answer, source bet. That's from the העני, Yitzchak Eben העזר למד א'. That's another question about Agunot. This time it's ט"ז טבת, תרמ"ו, 1886. כאוונא. נשאלתי על דבר עגונה אחת מלונדון, שזה כמה שנים שנאבד בעלה. So again, there is an Agunot from London, and for several years her husband had disappeared. וכעת, by the way, not every time that someone disappears is dead. Especially back then. People would go, we know that it happened unfortunately many times. People would go, especially to America, they would say to their wife, many times it would be a young wife with a child or 2 or 3, they would say, I would just go there, I would make some money, and then I would send you the money in order that you can buy a ticket and join me. And he would come to America and he would decide that the American girls are better, and he doesn't want to be stuck with the women and children that he left back in Europe. It wouldn't happen in one day, of course. It's a process, because far from the eye, far from the heart, and there would be an erosion, you may say, in his commitment to his wife and children, and it's very unfortunate. But it's something that we know happened many times. So just and he would not send a letter. Meaning, if he's a tzaddik, he would send a get in the mail to his wife. But we have to understand that there would almost be no one in the States, even if there was someone that is a tzaddik who wants to send a get to his wife. Who would write the get? And what adim would sign? I mean, you are as I said, you're in a spiritual desert. So it just happened again and again. So someone disappearing is really proof to nothing. So we have an Agunot from London that her husband has disappeared. וכעת אחר שדרשה בבית הפליציה דלונדון. What is פליציה? Police. She is going to the London police. We are in the 19th century. So she is going to the London police. השיבו לה, כי נמצא כתוב שם, so they were looking through the records. נמצא כתוב שם, אשר זה ערך זמן רב, נמצא איש נטבע בנהר הסמוך ללונדון. They found a man that drowned in the river near London. I guess it's the Thames? Yeah, I would guess. So they found a man that drew up in the river, ובתמונת הפוטוגרפי. And they have a photo. I don't know if in Russia at the time they had photographers just going around, but in London they had, and the police had, and each time they would find someone in the river they would take a photograph. So if someone later, people would come and look, they would be able to look at the photograph and recognize. And you can immediately see the question, can we rely on a photograph to allow this woman, let's say that she recognized, that's her husband, but no, it's a photograph in the 1880s, so we do not speak about how they call it, the 5 megapixel. It's something very, very, very grainy. So can you rely on this type of photographs in order to allow the woman to remarry? He says, תם מחוקי המדינה, כי יש שם ממונים מיוחדים מן הפוליציה, לבקש ולחפש בנהרות ובימים, אחר איזה נתבעים. It's wonderful. In London they have these Russian people from the police, that their job is to look through the rivers and see if someone did do, then they would try to, obviously I guess that the first reason is to try to save people, but if you cannot save him, at least you take a photograph. And כבר קברוהו, now he was already buried, they wouldn't, you have nothing to do with him, so they buried him after taking the photograph. And they also have the tabat and the arnak and the key. They have his ring, he was walking with a ring. They had his arnak, his wallet, his pouch, yeah, and they had his key. Now, this is another very big question. If you find someone dead with the objects of someone that disappeared, but you cannot recognize from the body now if that's the man that you are looking for or not, can you rely on the objects to know that this is the guy that disappeared? You can understand. That's a very tricky question, because it can easily be that someone just died and our guide walked through the body, or not died, or just went to sleep, and the guy that we just found here stole the ring and the wallet and the key. These are stealable objects, right? These are things that people do take. So that's very complicated.
So maybe murder.
Yeah. הכל כתוב שם על פי אגדת הממונים אינם יהודים שהגידו כן לפני ראשי הפוליציה. Now another question, the cops that are telling you that that's the object that they found, and that's the photograph that they took, they are all non-Jews. Can you rely on the testimony of non-Jews to allow a woman to remarry? And he says, האישה העגונה אומרת שהיא מכרת היטב בתמונה שהוא בעלה שנאבד. So the woman says, I see the photo and I am telling you, that's my husband. Now again, it's complicated because obviously she has, I'm not saying that she's chas v'chila lying, but you can understand that she has a real interest to recognize her husband. And you know that it is known to this day that people that have relatives that are missing, so they would tend to see these relatives in the street, in pictures, and they would think they recognize them. But that's a mirage, right? It's an illusion. It does happen. So all of that, can you rely or not? That's a question. And again, you can say, just think about it, but that's not the way halacha works. You're just thinking about it. Is this reliable or not? You have to bring proofs from the Talmud as close as you can to the specific case. And she has a photograph that they did when he was still alive. So again, it's London. It's a Western country. So they were taking photographs as a couple. So she has a photograph of him, and they can compare and contrast the photograph from when he was alive to the photograph after he drowned. Because I have to say, and I don't want to ruin anyone's appetite here, but people that are being taken out of the water after they drowned, they don't look like they looked like before they fell into the water. Well, that's enough. So can you rely on all of these questions? Shuvah. סומכים על דברי ערכאות. He says, first you should know, we can rely on non-Jews if they are in formal position. So if we spoke about police, if we speak about, I don't know, other records that are official records, you can rely on them. This is not a simple answer, but that's an answer that's a conclusion that he arrived in earlier responsa. And again, that opened a wide opening to be able to be matir, to be allowing many women to get remarried. Yeah.
Is he saying that for all countries? Like, isn't it ironic that he's coming from a country where there's corruption and bribery and lies beyond what we think would be the opposite?
It's very interesting. Yeah, he doesn't make this qualification, but to be honest, even if he's making this qualification, he wouldn't write it down, because you do not sit in Russia and write down, you can rely on the people in England, but the people in Russia are unreliable. That's not something, even in Hebrew, you don't write it. So I don't know that he makes the dividing line in writing anywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if in private he would recommend checking more in Russia. So he says we can rely on the non-Jews if they are official. ועל כן הוא הדין בנידון נידן, so the same thing goes for our case, שנמצא כתוב באפליציה תמונת הפוטוגרפי של המת, so that we have the photograph of the dead person in the police records, וגם מצאו אצלו הטבעת והארנקי והמפתח שהראו להם, they also found these objects, ודאי נאמנים הם על זה, so they can be relied upon, ויושיב כבוד תורתו בית דין שלושה ויתירו, so he says to the Rav in London, I don't know if it was Rav Herman Adler back then, I'm not sure who was, I think it was Rav Herman Adler, was the chief rabbi of England at the time, and he's telling him, take a court of 3 judges, these judges, if they were their own authority, they would just allow these women to remarry by herself. Obviously, these are judges by name, but they do not feel that they have the authority to allow these type of cases to give psika in. So they are relying on the authority of Rabbi Elchanan Spektor, and but now relying on this tshuva, they would allow these women to remarry. So again, fascinating, you see here, and being able to rely on official non-Jewish records. You see here photographs. You see here in the earlier tshuva, we saw the question of 2 rubai, of 2 majorities. All of these are not necessarily that he innovated the whole thing, but being able to combine all of these factors gave him very strong tools, as I said, to allow these women to remarry. And again, he had also the siyata dishmaya, the help from heaven, that he never was wrong, that he never gave a psak that someone can remarry and her husband reappeared. Another question, this time not about an aguna, but about an agun. That also can happen. So this time the wife ran away, and now the husband is coming to him, and he wants to marry a second wife. As we know, the Ashkenazim already 1,000 years ago had disallowed the practice of marrying 2 wives. Unless, in very specific cases, you can get 100 rabbis to sign on an hater, and then you'd be, obviously you need to convince 100 rabbis, and good luck with that, that to allow you. No, there are cases. Usually what you need to do is to convince someone like Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, and then you go with he's a hater, and everyone else would join. But it's not easy. Obviously, it's easier than if you are just stuck because your husband is disappearing. But so that's the case here. So this guy, his wife ran away, and he wants a permission to marry a second wife. Obviously says, I would write a get, I would leave the get by you, and if the woman would want, she can take her get, but I cannot be just stuck. So let's see the question. Also very reflective of the times. Source Gimel. נשאלתי באחד אשר תכף אחר החופה נשא אשתו למרחקים. So I guess the shidduch, the match was not great. So immediately after חופה, she ran away. וזה ערך יותר משנה שלו באה לבעלה, ובעלה נסע אחריה שמה, ולא השיבה כלו כלל. So this poor guy is chasing his new kala, his new wife, and she doesn't answer, and she's just running away. I mean, obviously, we cannot know the situation. Maybe she had good reasons, I don't know. But she's flying away. ויש גביית עדות מעד אחד, and they were able to receive a testimony from one עד, שהיא עוברת על דת משה, ויצאה לתרבות רעה, ומורדת על בעלה. So, as I said, this would happen. She decided, again, we cannot know. Maybe she was married by her parents, and she didn't want this husband. That's not something that is rare. What is new is that now women have, now I mean 150 years ago, things are beginning to change. There is nothing, no equality. Don't be wrong. We are speaking about Russia of the 1880s. Okay, so no mistakes here. But she is able to run away, maybe to convert, as I said, in order to leave aside her obligation to her husband, and she's free. And now what would the husband do? בעלה טוען בריא שהיא מורדת עליו בלא טענה, והקהל הדמוקרטי כשיצאה לתרבות רעה, everyone speak about her being יצאה לתרבות רעה, which is a clean language to say that she is not keeping הלכה anymore. ונשאלתי אם יש להתירו לישא אישה אחרת. So can we allow him in such a situation that she is not responsive and she disappeared, and everyone says, and we have also one testimony, and also people speak about her not keeping halacha anymore. So what would you say to this poor guy? In the end, he's a poor guy. So what would, I mean, he can be 14 years old, right? Yeah, so what are we doing now? He says, כיוון דלא נתברר רק על פי עד אחד, אבו דלא נוסיף עלה, ובאי לכל הפחות 100 רבנים שהסכימו להתיר. So he says, I do require that he would have 100 rabbis that would allow him, ויראו שהבעל ישליש ביטחונות, כי אולי תבוא האישה למדינתנו ותתבע מן הבעל כתובתה ושאר חיובים. He says, it's not enough that you should only give get. You must also give the sum of the ketubah. And that can be a big sum. You must keep, so the rabbi would get a get from you and would get all the money, so we would know that you are not just trying to find a way to get rid of your wife without paying her what is due. So you'd give also the money, and if she would come and she would have a good argument, why did she run away? Maybe you hit her, who knows? So maybe she would give a good argument, and then she would be able to get the get and to get the ketubah that you owe her. וכפי ראותיהם, וכן יראו שיהיה הכל ברישיון הממשלה. לפי חוקי אדוננו הקיסר ירום עודו. He says also everything must be legal. Nothing under the table. And that's, I guess that some Jews needs to be told that up front, right? Nothing under the table, please. Because, you know, again, that's not only 150 years ago. You know that in New York, just a few years ago, the government has jailed a certain rabbi that was working on getting gittin from husbands that didn't want to give a get. And he was doing his work by metal rods. So these are things that happen. So it's important for Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan to declare everything must be legal and over the table. And he says, אך לעת עתה אנו מאירינן לעניין להתירו לישא אישה אחרת, זהו בגדר איסורין, דעד אחד מימן. So he says, basically, I cannot rely on these rumors and this one witness in order to for you to take the wife's ketubah and keep it to yourself. So you must give the money of the ketubah. However, I do allow you to marry another woman, again, if you can get 100 timot, 100 signatures of other rabbis. So that's, again, from the other side of, I guess, of the familial division, but a question that is reflective of the time. Now we move from family matters into other matters, which I thought also are very interesting. So the העני, again, from the book העני, Yitzchak, this time from the section about אורח חיים. נשאלתי מרב גדול אחד על דבר האנשי חיל. So we spoke last week about the Cantonists. And I hope that you heard, we had a message from, about, you said that your grandfather?
My great-grandfather.
Was a Cantonist. You want to give a few, 5 minutes, the story?
Yeah, he grew up somewhere in Russia. And at the age of a young boy, He was put in the Cantonist army, in the army for, at the time, I think, Tsar Nikolai II.
Mhm.
And they had to serve 25 years with the army. And I heard the story that he would sleep without a pillow to remind himself that he was Jewish.
Wow.
And he served they were sent to Finland to protect Russia. And there's an island outside of Helsinki today where they have a museum. And my brother went there and he said that his great grandfather served there. And they said, oh, he must have been Jewish. So, yeah, they served 25 years and they were allowed to stay where they were. And they happened to be in Finland. And that's how the Jewish community started. And amazing stories how, then they didn't have enough women to marry. So they would bring on ox carts Jewish young ladies
From Russia,
from
the area.
places.
Wow.
And years later, they would stand at the market and say, I was the first one pulled down.
Wow.
That's how the Jewish community started. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, these are amazing stories, really amazing stories. So that's a question from this type of a story about אנשי חיל העומדים בעיר קרס שנכבשה תחת יד אדוננו הקיסר ירום הודו מן הטורקי. So here is a city that the Russians were able to conquer from the Turks, from the Ottoman Empire, and just as Anne told us, the Anshei Hail were allowed to remain in the place where they served. So now they are in this city. I should have checked before the show. I didn't check. Where is this Kars? I don't know. I guess in the Balkan somewhere, right? Russia has conquered places in the Balkan from the Turks, so I would guess it's there. So ביקשו אנשי חיל דשם מן השר שעל המבצר קרס, שייתן להם מקום לבית התפילה שלהם. So the soldiers, the former soldiers asked the officer that is responsible for the fort that he would give them a place to daven. And what he gave them, ברוב חסדו נתן להם בית תפילה, בבניין שהיה מקום תפילה לישמעאלים, מקודם שנכבשה תחת יד אדוננו הקיסר ירום הודו. So they had a mosque there for the Muslims, that they davened, they prayed there in the mosque. So the officer told them, we have here the mosque, that's the place where people pray, so you can also go there and pray. And the question to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan was, can we use a former mosque in order to have a Jewish shul? In the States, that's a question that repeated itself many times. Because Jews would come to a certain place, they would buy a former church, not a mosque there, but a former church, and the question was, are you allowed to use the church? And Reb Moshe Feinstein alone, I think, have 5 or 6 answers about this time. And it depends on the nature of the church and the nature of the selling and how exactly things are. And do you have to rebuild the whole thing? Can you leave the windows with the cross on them? And these are the stories of yesteryear. And these are very interesting stories. Now, it's our question here is not about Christians, which is more complicated, but about Muslims. Why is it easier when you speak about Muslims? Because they are not considered as idol worshippers. The Christians, according to most of the authorities, for sure the Catholics, but also many of it depends. The Protestants, do they have a cross? Don't they? Do they bow to the cross? So these are complicated matters with different opinions, but they would be considered by the majority of the poskim as avodah zara, which would render the house of worship basically as avodah zara houses, which would make it much more complicated to use as a shul. Nonetheless, as some of you I'm sure know, there were leniencies that were found in order to use. I myself, when we were in Shlichut in Toronto, so we went to St. Louis. They invited us to St. Louis for Tu Shabbatot. That's right. And Beit Avraham is in a former church. And that's why I mentioned the windows, because there you can, I don't know if today, but at least 10 years ago, you could still see on the windows. I think so. No, I'm wrong.
But no religious.
No religious symbols, so I take it back. However, I don't know why I remember that. But however, these were questions that were raised, and there, but you could still see on the shape of the building, it didn't look like your regular shul.
Michelle also, youngest year of Michelle, into the church, the seats were arranged in a cross.
Amazing, and they didn't change it even.
So there was a cemetery right in front
Oy
of
vey.
the
I'm sure they got some rabbinic approval for that. I'm sure. But yeah, these are stories that happen again and again. In Russia, they could not happen because no one would allow you to buy a church and then turn it into a shul. That's unheard of and would never happen. But in the States, it did happen many, many times. And here we speak about a mosque. So he is giving them a hater to use the mosque, and he is relying on two factors. One is that because it was conquered by the Russians and the Muslims had to run away, then it means that the Muslim had gave up on this house of worship. That's called nullification, bitul. So it is not an idol worship anymore. And they say even if they didn't if they were not nullifying it, nonetheless, they are not considered as idol worshippers, and that's why they're allowed. And then he go into some tangential there because he says, are we sure that they are not idol worshippers because they have the al-qibla, right? They have a certain stone that they worship in Mecca. So he's dealing with that a little. It's a very interesting digression, but again, we don't have the time to go into this discussion. But again, another interesting question that also reflects, I think, on the situation that he was having to deal with. The last one, again, extremely interesting one, source A. נדרשתי מן רב גדול אחד, שנשאל מן עיר אחד במדינת אמריקה. So again, a question from the US. It didn't come directly to him, so it came to some other rabbi, doesn't say who. In Europe, this rabbi felt that he's not up to the question, so he referred it to the greatest posek for the Ashkenazic world. Again, I told you, it's not even the Ashkenazic, the Litvish world, but the Litvish is the whole world, right? So the great posek of the Litvish world, and that is Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor. Now, I don't know about the history of this question. If someone here can enlighten us, that would be very welcomed. So that's a question. יש שם כמה בתי רופאים, so there are some hospitals there, ומצטרכים לגופים מתים לחותכם, and they need dead bodies in order to autopsy. So they want to do autopsy in order to research. And נודע כי הוצאו כמה מתים מקבריהם למאות ולאלפים. So again, I know nothing about it, but he says that this was the reality in this place in somewhere in the States, that the medical schools would just take out of the grave dead bodies and make their training on these dead bodies of people without asking for permission. והעשירים שוכרים שומרים על איזה ימים. So the situation is so bad that people that can afford it, they rent guards, they hire guards to keep the queen from being robbed. And he says, but they do it a few days, וזו הוצאה גדולה, it's a lot of money, וגם אין זה לתועלת, שלפי שגם אחר 3 שבועות יכולים לעשות כמעשה, even 3 weeks. After the burial, these guys come and take the deads out. What's called exhumate? Exhume the deads from the grave. So again, I don't know about the historicity of the. I mean, obviously it happened because that's the question that he gets. But I don't know where exactly did it happen. He says למאות ולאלפים. I found it amazing. Thousands of dead bodies are being taken out of the graves. Where? Anyhow, he says, what was the solution that was suggested? So the non-Jews that were also troubled by this problem, they began to bury in כוכים ומערות. So they would take caves and put their dead in the caves until they would rot. Excuse me for the graphic description, but until they would rot, and then they would bury in the cemetery only the bones. With the bones,
Nobody.
The medics can do nothing. So so the Jews there asked him if they can also do the same
Wow.
in order to avoid this problem. So he is getting into it. And again, I wouldn't read now the answer, but he says what he does is giving an historic survey, very interesting historical survey of the different minhagim of burial, because we are very used to what we are doing nowadays, which is taking a plot in the ground, 400, try 2 meters, and you put the dead body in there, and that's it. And in Chutz La'aretz they use an aron, right? How do you say an aron? A casket. They use a casket. But the casket usually is open from the bottom, right? No, they don't open it. Again, it's different minhagim. There are holes. Okay, but do you want a connection to the ground? It's very important because we have this concept והגוף ישוב לאדמה, right? That the body would return to the ground. It's very important for us that the body would return because we were made out of the ground, so we are returning into the ground. But here, the suggestion is that they would not return into the ground. They would just rot, right, in a cave. But he says we have to know that in certain places that was the common Jewish practice, and it would be done. And only after you would have bones, you'd put the bones into the ground, and it was considered completely legitimate. That's the way that the burial was done. So he says, in the same manner, you are allowed to do it in your places. So you take the casket. It does say, put some dust, some ground, some sand in the casket, and he says, if you can, bring sand from Eretz Israel. Now, I'm not sure how practical was it from people in the States to bring sand from Eretz Israel in the 1880s. That's what he suggests. He says if you are able to, and put the sand. And nowadays I know they do it. They do import sand, and they use it. And he says put it under him, under the body, and above the body, and over the eyes, and then put him in a casket and in a cave that you can control, or even a house that you can control. And only after you are sure that the remnants would not be bothered anymore by these training doctors, then you'd be able to bury the dead. Again, I find this a very interesting answer.
Where they do it in the wall.
Yeah, now that's right. But it's in the wall, but the wall they are taking great efforts to dig the wall in a way that there would be a connection to the ground. So they build in a very special way these walls.
Sorry.
It's out of necessity because we are running out of space. At least if you want to be buried in the Negev, that's one place. No, not Yochasrela, but if someone wants to be buried in the Negev, that's one thing. But if one wants to be buried in the center of Eretz Israel, then there are concessions to be made or to pay a lot of money. Yeah, the walls. Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, I find it a very interesting question and answer, both from the historical side of things that were happening and what he had to deal with, but also from the way that he answered it, because he had this wide view of Jewish history even that enabled him, because if you do not know that things were done in different ways in different times, that you are stuck with what you think is the only option. But if you know about Jewish history, then you are able to bring new ideas to the table, which I think is a very interesting, all the ideas, yes, which I think is very interesting. I will just finish with a few sentences about his legacy. So Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor died in 1896. 1896. His son replaced him in his role as the Kaaownא Rav, and the head of the kollel there, and the rest of the roles that his father had occupied. He had a very moving last will, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, in which he speaks about how important always was it for him to keep good relations with everyone. And he says, we must keep the peace, and everyone should be together. Well, that was his last will, and I'm sure that many people wanted to keep it. But Jewish history was not going on that direction in the end of the 19th century. And they say, it's very sad, but also, again, very reflective of the times. They say that all the Jews of Kaaownã made a special committee that was made out of the Maskilim and the Hasidim and the Litvaks. So everyone sat together in order to decide about the project of memory for Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. But each side tried to pull it to his direction. So the yeshivish guy said, let's make a new yeshiva on his name. And the Hasidic said, let's make a shul. And the Zionist said, let's make a Yitzchak. Right? That's the name. There are nowadays settlements in Eretz Israel after him. So let's make a settlement in Eretz Israel named after him. And each one, the Maskilim said, let's make a school, a new school, reform school after him. So everyone tried to pull in his own direction, and the end result was that nothing was done in his name. In Lithuania, which is amazing, but that's what happened. Nothing had been done, and that's again telling so much about his ability to keep everyone together. But when he disappeared, then נתפרקה החבילה, then everything went, everyone went on his own way. As you know, in the States, in the year of his death, they established RITZ, Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor Yeshiva, which is now part of Yeshiva University. Back then it was a yeshiva by itself, but now it's part of Yeshiva University. Now it was not that he had the students there. They just picked his name because he was loved by everyone. So they knew that if he's calling the yeshiva after him, everyone would accept it. So that's why they picked up his name. Very, very interesting. So that's how Ritz became to be called Ritz. One last story, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, after Yom Kippur War, had to deal with many, many questions of Agunot, because people disappeared during the Yom Kippur War. And he said that he was using mainly the tshuvot that were written by Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor. And he was a great fan of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. And one of the sons of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef called his son, meaning the grandson of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Yitzchak Elchanan. So that's from the Sephardic, from the Ashkenazic to the Sephardic world, very, very interesting, called him after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spektor. So his legacy, to a great way, is still with us. And obviously his legacy, his last will, calling us to keep together as one nation, is something that should, I think, should be sounded, and we should make our best efforts in these difficult times to follow it. Thank you so much, and Emir Hashem will continue next week.